Marcus Thompson guided his Range Rover up the pristine driveway of 1142 Oak Ridge Lane, casting a nervous glance at the gleaming white Colonial that would become their new home. In the rear-view mirror, he caught Jamal's expression of pure wonder, his 12-year-old son pressing his face against the window, despite the limitations of his mobility. The moment felt surreal. After 6 years of grueling overtime at his software engineering job and finally making partner, they were leaving their cramped 2-bedroom apartment behind. "What do you think, buddy?" Marcus asked, putting the car in park. "Is it everything we saw in the virtual tour?" "It's better, Dad." Jamal beamed, his infectious enthusiasm making Marcus's heart swell. "Look at all the space for my equipment. Can we set up the parallel bars near that big oak tree?" Marcus nodded, already envisioning the therapeutic haven they'd create in their sprawling backyard. The real estate agent had assured them that the HOA had approved all their requests for adaptive equipment installation, a crucial factor in their decision to purchase in Oak Ridge Estates. The neighborhood's proximity to the state's top-rated school for children with special needs had sealed the deal. As their moving truck rumbled up the street, Marcus helped Jamal into his wheelchair, their practiced routine smooth after years of perfecting it. The autumn breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and possibility. Several neighbors were out walking their dogs or tending to their immaculate gardens, offering polite but reserved waves. "Welcome to the neighborhood," called out an elderly man walking his golden retriever. "I'm Richard from number 1138, haven't seen new faces around here in a while." Marcus was about to respond when movement caught his eye, a curtain twitching in the house next door. Through the window he glimpsed a woman with perfectly coiffed gray hair, her phone raised as she photographed their moving truck. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of obvious disapproval, and something cold settled in Marcus's stomach. The movers had just started unloading Jamal's specialized equipment when the woman emerged from her house, designer handbag swinging purposefully as she approached. Her pearls gleamed in the sunlight, and her expensive tennis outfit seemed at odds with her scowling expression. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced politeness that set Marcus's teeth on edge. "I'm Linda Whitman, HOA president. I couldn't help but notice you're unloading some rather unusual items." Before Marcus could explain, she continued, "We have very strict guidelines about visible medical equipment and external modifications. I'm sure you understand, we need to maintain certain standards." Jamal's excitement visibly deflated, his shoulders slumping in his wheelchair. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he reached for the folder of approved permits in his back pocket. "Actually, Mrs. Whitman, we have all the necessary." "Oh, I'm sure you think you do," Linda interrupted, her smile not reaching her eyes. "But I'll need to review everything personally. We've had some issues with certain new residents not quite understanding our community's expectations." The way she emphasized certain made Marcus's skin crawl. He was about to respond when another neighbor approached, a young Asian woman pushing a stroller. "Hi, I'm Sarah Chen from across the street," she said warmly, positioning herself between Marcus and Linda. "Don't mind Linda, she likes to welcome everyone this way. I think it's wonderful you're making the space accessible. My sister uses similar equipment." Linda's expression soared further. "Sarah, the architectural committee hasn't." "Actually," Sarah interrupted smoothly, "they'd approved everything last month. I was at the meeting." She turned to Marcus and Jamal, deliberately ignoring Linda's spluttering. "Let us know if you need help setting anything up. My husband's great with tools." As Linda stalked back to her house, Marcus caught her muttering something about property values and neighborhood character. The moving truck's hydraulic lift whirred as it lowered another piece of Jamal's equipment, and Marcus knew their dream house had just become a battlefield. 3 hours in, and the battle lines were already being drawn. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, but the serenity lasted only until Marcus stepped outside to head to work. There, stuck beneath his windshield wiper, with surgical precision, was an official-looking letter in a pristine white envelope. The HOA logo glared up at him in aggressive red font. "Immediate ATTNTION required." Marcus glanced at his watch, 7:15 a.m. He planned on dropping Jamal at his new school early to meet with the special education coordinator, but something told him he needed to read this now. His hands trembled slightly as he tore open the envelope, the paper inside crisp and heavy, like a corporate termination notice. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. Dear new resident, the following violations have been observed at 1142 Oak Ridge Lane within the last 24 hours. 1. Unauthorized medical equipment visible from street view. 2. Non-standard moving truck exceeding 6-hour parking limitation. 3. Unapproved structural modifications. Ramp installation pending. 4. Excessive noise during equipment unloading. 5. Non-conforming vehicle, medical transport van, in driveway. 6. Unauthorized gathering, moving assistance, without proper notification. 7. Potential business operation, medical facility, in residential zone. Immediate compliance is required within 48 hours. Failure to address these violations will result in daily fines of $500 per infraction and possible legal action. Regards, Linda Whitman, HOA President. A phone number followed, along with a postscript that read, historical property values in Oak Ridge Estates have been maintained through strict adherence to community standards. We trust you understand the importance of maintaining these standards. Marcus crumpled the paper in his fist, then immediately smoothed it out again. He'd need this for his lawyer. Through the kitchen window, he could see Jamal eating breakfast, chatting animatedly with their home health aide, Maria, about his new school. His son's excitement made the letter in his hands feel even more poisonous. Dad? Jamal's voice carried from the doorway. What's wrong? Marcus quickly folded the letter, forcing a smile. Nothing, buddy. Just some HOA paperwork. Is it about my equipment? Jamal's voice was small, knowing. At 12, he was already too familiar with discrimination, could read it in people's awkward glances and forced smiles. Before Marcus could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Sarah Chen stood on their porch, holding an identical envelope and looking furious. Did you get one too? She asked, waving her letter. Linda's been busy this morning, half the street got violations. Funny how it's only the homes with non-standard additions. She made air quotes around the word, her disgust evident. We've lived here 5 years, Sarah continued, stepping inside. Every time someone who doesn't fit Linda's vision moves in, this happens. Last month it was the Rodriguez family's basketball hoop. Before that, the paddles, prayer flags. She uses the HOA like her personal enforcement squad. Marcus handed her his letter. 7 violations in 24 hours, must be some kind of record. Sarah scanned it, her eyebrows rising. Medical facility? Really? She pulled out her phone. I'm calling my brother. He's a civil rights attorney. This is textbook discrimination. Through the window, they could see Linda Power walking past their house, her phone raised, presumably documenting more violations. She had backup today. 2 other women in tennis outfits, all 3 peering critically at Jamal's mobility equipment in the backyard. The last family she harassed moved out after 2 weeks, Sarah said quietly. Please don't let her win this time. Marcus watched his son, now showing Maria how he could transfer himself from his wheelchair to the breakfast bar, a skill he'd practiced for months. They'd chosen this house not just for its location, but for its potential to give Jamal independence. No amount of threatening letters would take that away. Don't worry, Marcus said, reaching for his phone. I document everything and I fight dirty when I have to. Linda Whitman just picked the wrong family to harass. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center buzzed with artificial pleasantry as residents filed in for the monthly HOA meeting. Marcus arrived early, armed with a folder of permits, architectural approvals, and ADA regulations. He noticed Linda had strategically positioned herself at the head table, surrounded by her tennis club allies, their matching pastel cardigans creating a wall of enforced conformity. Item number 17 on tonight's agenda. Linda announced 3 hours into the meeting, her voice dripping with rehearsed concern. Special considerations for 1142 Oak Ridge Lane. The way she emphasized special made several residents shift uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus had sat through discussions about acceptable mailbox colors, the proper height for garden gnomes, and an exhaustive debate about seasonal wreath protocols. Now, as the clock neared 10 p.m., he understood Linda's strategy. Wear down the audience, then strike. As you can see from these photographs, Linda continued, clicking through a meticulously prepared PowerPoint presentation. Certain modifications have been made without proper consideration for community aesthetics. The screen filled with images of Jimel's therapy equipment, shot from unflattering angles in harsh lighting. I have all the necessary approvals right here, Marcus interjected, rising from his seat. Signed and dated by the Architectural Committee last month. Linda's smile tightened. Yes, well, about those approvals, she gestured to a nervous-looking man in the corner. Mr. Peterson from the Architectural Committee has some concerns about the thoroughness of the initial review. Mr. Peterson wouldn't meet Marcus's eyes as he stammered. We may have overlooked certain aspects of the aesthetic impact. While we're on the subject, Linda continued smoothly, producing a thick folder. I've documented similar unauthorized modifications throughout the neighborhood. She began projecting photos of other homes, the Rodriguez family's basketball hoop, the Chen's traditional birding sculptures, the Patel's prayer flags. Every single example was from a minority family's home. Sarah Chen stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. My garden was approved 2 years ago. Sit down, Sarah, Linda snapped. We're discussing 1142 Oak Ridge Lane, not your exotic decorations. A murmur ran through the crowd. Marcus noticed several residents recording the interaction on their phones. Linda seemed oblivious to the growing tension, launching into a presentation about historical property values and neighborhood character. My son, Marcus said, his voice cutting through Linda's monologue, has cerebral palsy. Every piece of equipment in our yard helps him build strength, independence, and dignity. All of it was approved, all of it is necessary, and all of it is protected under federal law. No one's questioning your son's condition, Linda replied, her voice honey-sweet. We're simply concerned about maintaining standards, perhaps a more suitable neighborhood. Are you suggesting we should move? Marcus's question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Well, there are communities better equipped for special needs, Linda offered, looking around for support. But the room had grown notably still. Richard, the elderly man with the golden retriever, cleared his throat. Linda, my late wife, used similar equipment after her stroke. Are you saying she shouldn't have been allowed to live here either? Linda's composure cracked slightly. That was different. How? The question came from Mrs. Rodriguez. How was it different, Linda? The room erupted in overlapping conversations. Marcus remained standing, watching Linda's carefully orchestrated ambush crumble. He caught Sarah's eye across the room. She was already typing furiously on her phone, presumably updating her brother, the civil rights attorney. This meeting is adjourned, Linda announced, gathering her papers with shaking hands. No, Marcus said firmly, it's not. We still need to vote on the motion to approve my modifications, you know, the ones already approved last month. The vote was 47-3 in favor, with only Linda and her 2 tennis friends dissenting. As people filed out, several stopped to introduce themselves to Marcus, offering support and apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Linda's voice carried across the emptying room. This isn't over. There are proper channels. You're right, Marcus replied calmly. It's not over. And believe me, Linda, you won't like what comes next. The September afternoon glowed with perfect autumn light as Jumel and his best friend Kevin prepared to celebrate Jumel's 13th birthday in the Thompsons' backyard. Marcus had spent the morning setting up streamers and balloons around the parallel bars, transforming the therapeutic equipment into festive party decorations. A banner reading Champion's Birthday hung between 2 posts, celebrating both Jumel's special day and his recent breakthrough in physical therapy. Watch this, Kevin, Jamal called out, gripping the parallel bars with determined hands. 10 steps now, no breaks. Kevin, who had become Jumel's closest friend since they'd moved in 3 months ago, stood at the other end of the bars with an encouraging grin. You've got this, Jay. Remember, just like in therapy. Marcus watched from the patio, recording the moment on his phone as Jamal began his careful journey. 1 step, then another, his face set in concentration. Other kids from the neighborhood were arriving for the party, gathering around to cheer him on. That's when Linda Whitman emerged from her house like a storm cloud in designer activewear. This is unacceptable, she shrieked, phone raised high, already live streaming to her neighborhood watch group. Look at this gathering. No permits, no prior notification. Jamal faltered mid-step, his rhythm broken by Linda's outburst. Marcus rushed forward, but Kevin was already there, supporting his friend. Mrs. Whitman, Kevin's mother, Patricia, called out from where she was setting up the cake table. "It's a children's birthday party. We're well within the noise ordinance hours. These delinquents are destroying property values." Linda continued, ignoring Patricia and moving closer, her phone still recording. "Look at this equipment. Look at this crowd." The children had gone quiet, party hats drooping as they watched the scene unfold. Jamal's hands gripped the bars tighter, his knuckles white with tension. "My son," Marcus said, his voice deliberately calm, "is showing his friends how far he's come in his therapy. On his birthday, step away from my property, Linda." Instead, Linda's fingers flew across her phone screen. Moments later, her voice cut through the awkward silence. "Yes, 911. I need to report suspicious individuals at 1142 Oak Ridge Lane. They're violating multiple ordinances and there's unauthorized equipment being used for unknown purposes." Patricia, who had been recording everything since Linda appeared, whispered to Marcus, "She picked the wrong family to mess with. Keep your cool, we've got this documented." The children huddled closer to Jamal, forming an instinctive protective circle. Kevin hadn't left his friend's side, his young face showing a mixture of confusion and anger. "I just wanted to show them I could walk," Jamal said quietly, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. Linda's voice grew more strident. "Yes, officer, there's a large gathering of people, and they're using some kind of equipment. I don't feel safe. They clearly don't belong in this neighborhood." Marcus felt something snap inside him, not in rage but in clarity. He turned to the gathered parents and children. "Everyone, please stay. Enjoy the party. The police will arrive and they'll see exactly what's happening here. A birthday celebration for my son, who has worked harder to take 10 steps than Linda has walked in her entire life." Sarah Chen, who had rushed over when she saw the commotion, began leading the kids in a chorus of "Happy Birthday." Other neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the noise. Instead of dispersing, they joined the party, bringing additional chairs and snacks. Linda's live stream faltered as she realized her audience wasn't reacting as expected. Comments flooded her feed. "Leave those kids alone. It's a birthday party, Karen. Someone saved this video for the lawyer." Through it all, Jamal remained at his parallel bars, Kevin steadfast beside him. "Want to try those 10 steps again?" Kevin asked, ignoring Linda completely. Jamal looked at his friend, then at the supportive faces around him. His grip steadied. "Yeah," he said, his voice growing stronger. "And this time I think I can make it 15. Within hours of Linda's 911 call going viral on social media, Oak Ridge Estates transformed from a quiet suburban enclave into a community awakening to its conscience. The first signs appeared on the Chen family's lawn, blue and yellow disability awareness ribbons fluttering in the evening breeze. By nightfall, the ribbons had spread like wildfire, appearing on mailboxes, trees, and front doors throughout the neighborhood. "Did you see what's trending?" Sarah Chen asked, showing Marcus her phone as neighbors gathered on his lawn. The hashtag Oak Ridge for All had exploded, with Linda's live stream being shared thousands of times, each share accompanied by increasingly outraged comments. Local news stations were picking up the story, their vans parked discreetly at the neighborhood's entrance. But the real revolution was happening on the ground. Children from Jamal's party had gone home and told their parents everything. Those parents told other parents, and soon, the story of Linda's birthday party ambush sparked something unexpected: action. "I have security footage," Mrs. Patel announced, hurrying over with her laptop. "From last Diwali, when our decorations mysteriously disappeared. Look who's in the frame at 2 a.m. The gathered neighbors watched in stunned silence as night vision footage showed Linda, dressed in dark clothing, methodically removing traditional Indian lanterns from the Patel's porch. "I thought I was imagining things," Sarah Chen said, her voice shaking. "Last Chinese New Year, our decorations vanished too. I convinced myself it must have been the wind." More neighbors came forward, each with their own story. The Rodriguez family's basketball hoop had been reported 7 times for being 2 inches too high. The Almond family's children had been accused of suspicious behavior, while selling Girl Scout cookies. Each incident, when viewed in isolation, could have been dismissed as an overzealous HOA president. Together, they painted a damning picture. As the sun set, something remarkable happened. Families began bringing out chairs, tables, and food. The impromptu gathering turned into a community meeting, but unlike the sterile HOA sessions, this one crackled with purpose. "My grandson uses a wheelchair," Richard, the man with the golden retriever, announced. "I never said anything when Linda complained about the possibility of a ramp at my house. I should have spoken up then. I'm speaking up now." Kevin's mother, Patricia, who worked in local government, had brought copies of state and federal housing regulations. "What Linda's doing isn't just morally wrong," she explained, distributing the documents. "It's illegal. The HOA's own bylaws have anti-discrimination clauses that she's violating." Children had taken over the sidewalks with chalk, drawing colorful messages of inclusion and support. "Maya Fariendi can Waelk 15 steepies," proclaimed one message outside the Thompsons' house, decorated with hearts and stars. Linda emerged from her house several times, phone raised, but retreated quickly when she realized every neighbor had their phones out too, documenting her every move. Her usual allies were nowhere to be seen. The evening's most powerful moment came when Mrs. Johnson, an elderly resident who rarely left her house, shuffled over with the help of her nurse. "I've lived here for 40 years, she announced, her voice wavering but clear. "Linda removed my garden bench last spring, said it was an unauthorized modification. That bench was where I rested during my cancer recovery walks. I couldn't prove it was her, but we all knew." As night fell, the neighbors organized committees, not for monitoring lawn height or mailbox colors, but for real change. A legal team to review HOA policies. A welcoming committee focused on celebrating diversity. A fundraising group for accessible playground equipment at the community park. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," Sarah Chen said as the gathering finally wound down. "Linda's not going to go quietly." Marcus looked around at his neighbors, really looked at them for the first time, not as adversaries or allies in an HOA war, but as people who had found their voices. "Let her make noise," he replied. "We're louder now." Officer James Rodriguez and his partner, Officer Sarah Miller, arrived at Oak Ridge Estates with their body cameras activated and a clear understanding of the situation. 3 separate calls had come through dispatch. Linda's hysterical complaint about suspicious activities, and 2 counter calls from neighbors reporting harassment and potential hate crimes. "Good afternoon," Officer Rodriguez called out as he approached the gathering. "I understand there's been a disturbance during a birthday celebration." Linda burst from her house before anyone could respond, clutching a thick binder labeled HOA violations. "Finally. Officers, I've documented everything. These people," she gestured wildly at the Thompsons' yard, "are running some kind of unauthorized medical facility. There are children everywhere, using dangerous equipment." Officer Miller surveyed the scene. Birthday balloons swaying in the breeze, children safely playing under parental supervision, and Jamal, still at his parallel bars, now showing a younger child how they helped him walk. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said, his voice professionally neutral, but his eyes sharp, "this is the 4th 911 call you've made this month about suspicious families in your neighborhood. Would you like to explain what makes them suspicious?" Linda bristled. "Well, obviously," she stopped, suddenly aware of the body cameras and the dozens of phones still recording her. "I'm just trying to maintain community standards." "By reporting a disabled child's birthday party as a crime?" Officer Miller asked, reviewing the call log on her tablet. "Our dispatch notes show you've made 23 calls in the past 6 months, all about minority residents. That's a concerning pattern, Mrs. Whitman." Officer Rodriguez turned to Marcus. "Sir, my sister has cerebral palsy. I recognize this equipment. May I ask if you have proper permits?" Marcus handed over his folder of documentation. "Everything was approved months ago, officer. We have ADA compliance certificates, HOA architectural approval, and city permits." Linda interjected. "Those approvals were rushed through. They didn't consider." "Mrs. Whitman," Officer Rodriguez cut in firmly, "are you aware that interfering with ADA accommodations is a federal offense? or that making false police reports can result in criminal charges. Officer Miller had moved closer to Linda, speaking in lower tones. "We have footage of your previous calls, ma'am. Reporting children selling Girl Scout cookies as suspicious loiterers, calling SWAT on a family having a Diwali celebration, filing noise complaints against a prayer gathering that hadn't even happened yet." The color drained from Linda's face. "I was just doing my duty as HOA president. This neighborhood has standards." "The law has standards too," Officer Rodriguez replied. "Standards against harassment, discrimination, and making false police reports." He turned to address the gathered neighbors. Would anyone else like to make a statement about their experiences with Mrs. Whitman? Hands rose across the crowd. Officers spent the next hour taking statements, their body cameras recording each account. Linda's tennis club allies watched from their windows but didn't emerge to defend her. "One more thing," Officer Miller said, reviewing her notes. "We have reports of property destruction, religious decorations, cultural items, medical equipment. Would anyone like to press charges?" Linda's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. I've lived here for 20 years. You can't just—" "Actually, they can," Patricia interjected, holding up her phone. "I've just received confirmation from the district attorney's office. They're very interested in pursuing this case." Officer Rodriguez knelt beside Jamal's wheelchair. "Hey buddy, sorry your birthday party got interrupted. My sister uses bars just like these. Keep working hard, okay?" As the officers prepared to leave, they handed Linda a stack of papers. "These are copies of every complaint filed against you today. I'd suggest getting a lawyer, Mrs. Whitman, and please, don't make any more 911 calls unless there's a genuine emergency." The neighbors watched as Linda stormed back to her house, slamming the door hard enough to shake her block captain plaque loose. It clattered to the ground, cracking in two, a fitting symbol for the end of her reign of terror. "Now," Marcus announced, turning back to the crowd, "who wants cake?" The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the community center's main hall, but by 6:30, the parking lot was already overflowing. Residents who had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for decades but had never attended a single meeting found themselves arriving early, armed with documentation and determination. The usual beige walls were now covered with evidence: screenshots of Linda's discriminatory social media posts, security camera footage of her late-night decoration removals, and a damning timeline of her selective enforcement of HOA rules. Sarah Chen's civil rights attorney brother, Michael, had organized the presentation with devastating precision. Linda arrived at 6:55, flanked by her remaining allies, now down to just 3 of her tennis club friends. Her usual confident stride had been replaced by a nervous shuffle, and her designer handbag couldn't quite hide the legal papers she'd been served with earlier that week. "Before we begin," Linda announced, trying to take her usual position at the head table, "I want to remind everyone that as HOA president—" Actually, Michael Chen interrupted, rising from his seat. "According to HOA bylaws section 7.3, any board member under investigation for civil rights violations is temporarily suspended from their duties. Please take a seat in the general audience, Mrs. Whitman." The room erupted in murmurs as Linda's face turned scarlet. She moved to protest, but her own tennis friends supplely shifted away from her, leaving her standing alone. "Now," Michael continued, "we have documented evidence of at least 47 discriminatory incidents over the past 3 years. Would anyone like to share their experiences?" What followed was 3 hours of testimony that left many in tears. Mrs. Patel described how her children stopped inviting friends over after Linda's repeated suspicious activity reports. The Rodriguez family shared video of Linda measuring their basketball hoop with a laser level at midnight. Richard, the elderly resident, revealed how Linda had threatened to fine him for installing a temporary wheelchair ramp for his grandson's visit. But the final evidence, Michael announced, comes from Linda's own next-door neighbor. He nodded to a quiet woman in the back, Mrs. Anderson, who had lived beside Linda for 15 years. Mrs. Anderson stepped forward, tablet in hand. "I've been recording Linda's rants over our shared fence for the past year," she said, her voice shaking. "I started after she told me to remove my pride flag because it sent the wrong message." The audio recordings played through the community center speakers, Linda's voice crystal clear. "We need to keep the neighborhood pure. These people don't understand our standards. If we let one of them in, they'll all want to live here." Linda stood up, her voice shrill. "That's taken out of context. I'm being framed. I'll sue everyone in this room." The HOA's lawyer, Mr. Peters, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "Mrs. Whitman, I strongly advise against making threats. The evidence of discriminatory practices is overwhelming. The association itself could be liable if we don't take immediate action." The vote was almost anticlimactic. By a margin of 156-4, Linda was removed as HOA president and banned from serving on any community committees. Additional motions passed to create new anti-discrimination guidelines, establish a diversity and accessibility board, and allocate funds for inclusive community events. As Linda stormed toward the exit, she turned for one final declaration. "This neighborhood will regret this. You're destroying everything I built." "No, Linda," Marcus replied calmly, "we're building something better, something that includes everyone." The meeting concluded with the election of a new HOA board, one that actually reflected the community's diversity. Sarah Chen became president, with Marcus as vice president and Mrs. Rodriguez as treasurer. Their first official act was to approve funding for an accessible playground design. As people filed out into the evening air, there was a palpable sense of change. Neighbors who had barely spoken before made dinner plans. Children who had been warned to stay away from certain houses played together on the community center lawn. And on Linda's perfectly manicured front lawn, a sign appeared overnight. "For Israeli by Omunair." The Queen had fallen, and Oak Ridge Estates could finally become the community it was meant to be.